Well, I think if you were to ask me and you were to say, Danny, are you a carpenter? Are you a fix-it kind of guy? I would tell you yes. I've fixed things. I've built things. I enjoy it. There's just something about it. Honestly, there is a piece of it in my life, too, that I feel like connects me with Christ. Christ was a carpenter, so I always kind of think of that sometimes when I'm building. But let me tell you, though, jobs are a lot easier to do when you have the right tools. And I can't tell you how many times I found myself in a situation where I can't fix something, and then I need a certain tool, and then when I go to look for the tool to do the job, I can't do it. I can't tell you how many times I've used a butter knife as a screwdriver. Any of you all ever done that before? Okay? Yeah, it's hard. It's hard, okay? It's so much harder. I've used butter knives. I can remember a couple times I've used a hammer to hit a piece of pipe to turn the gasket on it, kind of hit it because I didn't have a pipe wrench with me. Let me tell you, doing a job without the right tools is really, really hard to do. Now, when it comes to life's problems, when it comes to the problems that we have in life, the same is true too. A lot of times I think we try to go through life and we try to fix the problems that confront us with the wrong tools. And a lot of times, well, every time really, the wrong tool is me, is us. We try to fix things ourselves, don't we? We try to we try to do it on our own effort. We try to multiply, if you run a business, maybe you're trying to multiply your business on your own. And maybe you think if you just have more stuff, if you have more people in your life, maybe even if you had more fun, that somehow we could fix the problems that we have in our lives and that things will get better if we just did that. And what we end up finding is that the tools don't work. And I bet you right now in your life today, as we start this new year, there is something in your life today that you're trying to fix, and you're trying to fix it on your own. I don't know. Maybe it's a marriage issue. Maybe in your marriage today, you are just having some really big struggles, and so you're trying your hardest to fix this marriage. Maybe you think it's all about fixing the other person. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that when I've done counseling. Like, it's always the other person's fault, so I need to fix them. Maybe that's something you're trying to do on your own. Maybe it's a financial situation. Maybe it's a friendship. It's a medical ailment. You're trying to take care of things all by yourself because you think, and let me tell you, I can't tell you how many times I've been here, you think that the more you know and the harder that you work at it, that you can fix it yourself. I know some of us in here today, maybe we're going through grief and we think we can fix it all on our own, that we can walk through this by ourselves. And then when it doesn't happen, when it isn't fixed, then the question is, what are we supposed to do? I mean, the question I'm asking us today is this: how am I supposed to fix something when I don't have anything to fix it with? When I don't have the right tools? I mean, what are you supposed to do when you don't have enough energy, when you don't have enough wisdom, when you don't have enough, when you're not smart enough or intelligent enough or powerful enough to fix the person or the circumstance in which you're struggling? In Mark chapter 6, there's these two stories that I think are very much connected, but yet they're different. And I want to go through them together with you today. We're going to start off in verse 30. So Mark chapter 6, verse 30. And we're going to see Jesus do two things that are seemingly impossible. Because I bet that's where they and us too, where we feel like we're at times. We're in an impossible situation. We don't have the tools, we don't have the energy, we don't have the wisdom, whatever it is, we don't have it. And so the situation that's confronting you today just seems impossible and seems maybe even overwhelming. And that's what we see in these two circumstances in Mark chapter 6. Now, before I start reading it with you, Jesus, if you remember, and it's been a few weeks, we took a few weeks off here for Christmas as we're restarting Mark here today. If you remember, Jesus had been going through, I guess what you would call a ministry tour. He had been touring around, sharing the gospel, healing, doing these great and amazing miracles. Of course, the miracles got the headlines, but the teaching is really what Jesus was trying to get across. And as we come to this passage today, this tour is continuing with these two amazing events. And I'm going to be reading today from the New Living Translation. So if you don't have the New Living Translation, we'll have it up here on the screen. But if we start off in verse 30, here's what it says. It says, "The apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all that they had done and taught." If you remember last time, the disciples had been sent out in groups of 2 to go out and share the gospel, to do miracles, and they had an amazing time. And so they come back and they talk to Jesus. And so Jesus says to them in verse 31, "Well, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while." And he said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So they didn't have time to talk about what had happened. They didn't even have time to eat. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. You know, it's almost as if when we look at this, that people are now, the popularity and the knowledge of Jesus has grown so much that people are like it's almost like they're on pilgrimage to Capernaum to meet Jesus. And so and actually, if you look in Luke chapter 9, because remember, this is only one of the 4 gospel accounts. If you look in Luke chapter 9, it tells us that they went by boat to the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee, which tended to be less populated. But when they got there, they thought, okay, we're going to this least populated place. We won't see as many people. Well, when they get there, guess what? People are waiting on them. People know that they're there. It says in verse 33, "Many people recognized them and saw them leaving, and people from many towns ran ahead, and look what they did. They ran along the shore." So they saw them out in boats, but they just followed them along. Because remember, the Sea of Galilee, you could see across the Sea of Galilee. It's a big lake, but it's still one that you can see across. And so they see Jesus and his disciples in a boat trying to go to this quiet place. And so what do? They're so excited, and they want to see Jesus so much that they run along the shore to meet him. And so when they pull up to the shore, there they were. Now, some of the disciples, I imagine, when they see this, they have got to be thinking, "You have got to be kidding me." Because they were tired. I mean, they had just gone out in groups of 2 and scattered around to different places. They had taught, they had done miracles. They just wanted to come back and spend time with Jesus, and they wanted to rest and kind of recuperate from the trip. And then here it is, there's more people. And in verse 34, Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so what did Jesus do? It says he began teaching them many things. And late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's getting really late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat." I love what the disciples are doing here. They're passing the buck. It's that saying. They're passing. They didn't want to have to deal with feeding the crowds. They said, let's just send everybody away. They can go figure out their meals, their food, what they're going to do on their own. But then Jesus says to them in verse 37, and this had to have been really perked their attention. Jesus said, "You feed them." Now remember, these guys are tired, probably a little frustrated, a little overwhelmed, and now Jesus is going to add to it by saying, "You feed them." Now Jesus knew this was an impossible request for them. Jesus knew that he knew they couldn't feed everybody. And so they asked, well, fair question, right? They're like, with what? What are we going to feed them with? We'd have to work for months. As a matter of fact, it would actually have to be for 8 months for them to get the amount of money that would be needed to buy the food that they needed. We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all of these people. And then Jesus said, "How much bread do you have? Go and find out." So what do the disciples do? They kind of go out on this little scavenger hunt. They kind of go around to a lot of different places trying to, in the crowd, finding out, okay, who's got food, who doesn't. And then they come back and they report, it says, that we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And then Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, something I want to say here, it's kind of a little bit of an aside, but it's important. Sometimes when we read passages in the Bible, we can overlook details because we're busy looking in the bigger picture, the bigger scheme of what's being taught, that we can miss little details. One of the little details I wanted to point out here is it mentions that they were sitting down in green grass. Now, for you and me, we would think green grass, well, yeah, of course, it's green grass. But over there, grass doesn't stay green for very long. It's very dry. It's a very arid place. So what this tells us is that this took place sometime in the spring. It's kind of in the wetter time of year. So it's a kind of a nice spring day. You kind of get in this picture, right? Everybody's sitting down on this nice spring day. Here's Jesus, but yet the disciples are freaking out because they don't have enough food. So it says in verse 40, they sat down in groups of 50 or 100, and Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up toward heaven, and he blessed them, and then he broke the loaves into pieces, and he kept giving the bread to the disciples so that they could distribute it to the people, and he also divided the fish for everyone to share. See, Jesus understood, okay, I've got to stop my teaching now because people's stomachs are getting in the way. Jesus was mindful of the physical nature of who we are, even though what we really need is the spiritual food that he was bringing to us. And then in verse 42, it says that everybody ate as much as they wanted. And afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish, and over 5,000 people and their families were fed. It's a lot of people. What a great miracle. Now, we don't know how much time it took in that moment to distribute the food out to everyone, but think about this. God took something that seemed insignificant, and he multiplied it. I mean, we know from another passage, from another place in the Gospels, that there was this young boy that had the food. Took this insignificant amount of food, might have fed maybe 5 or 6 people, and he multiplied it. See, here's what I think we see in this, is that Jesus, we'll bring it up here on the screen, Jesus, his power is magnified through the little things. See, Jesus can take the little things in life, and if we hand it over to him, he can magnify it. I like what one person said. They said, in the hands of Jesus, little is always much. And I don't know what it is that you have. Maybe you don't have much financially. Maybe you don't have much in relationships. Maybe you feel like you don't have much with talents or abilities. Let me tell you, and I want to encourage you today as we enter this new year, that whatever little you have, if you place it in the hands of Jesus, it's much. You know, one of the greatest things about Jesus when we look at this story is that he took note of the details. He saw the details in that moment of the people who needed to be fed, and so he took something little and made something so big. And as we start this new year in 2023, we might be wondering, what next? I mean, maybe you don't know how you're going to meet the next demand or challenge in your life. Maybe it just seems impossible, just like the disciples felt in that moment when it came to feeding all these people. I mean, maybe there's something that is so big and seems so overwhelming that's confronting you, and you're asking yourself the question, how are you going to overcome it? And the pressure mounts, and then the anxiety comes in, and the panic sets in, and you're losing sleep over it, and you're wondering, how is this going to work out? You know, we often stress out and we worry because we look at what we have. That's where the disciples were. They're like, how are we going to do this? Look at they were so focused on what was right there in front of them that they forgot the person who was standing next to them. All of us in here are guilty of that. All of us. And so what I want to encourage you as you enter this year is to look at a problem in your life in the same way that Jesus looked at this problem on that day. You know what he saw this problem as? He saw this problem as an opportunity. He saw this problem as an opportunity to overcome something that seemed so impossible and show that with God anything is possible. And that's what he did. And that's what he showed the disciples that day. You know what? Something that I thought was quite interesting. Did you know that in the Gospels that there's only one story? There's only one story in the Gospels, in all 4 of the Gospels, that's in all 4 of them. There's only one story, and this is it. It's the only one. There are some that's in 3 of the Gospels or 2 of the Gospels. There are some stories that's just in 1 Gospel. But this is the only story that's in all 4 of them. Why is that? Because it must have made a humongous impact on the writers and on the disciples. And I'm sure as they move forward in their lives, when they confronted much difficulty, as we know, as we read later in the book of Acts, even through some of the letters, I'm sure that they remembered that day vividly on how God, through Christ, provided in an impossible situation. And I want you to take your problem. I want you to think of it right now. And think of bringing it into that situation that they faced. And remember that Jesus is there. You know what? Sometimes things in life, they seem impossible, but I want to encourage you to not focus on the problem. Focus on the person who can be the solution. One of the things that, I don't know, maybe I don't know if you probably haven't been as frustrated as me, and I don't know that frustrated is really the right word for me here in what I'm saying here, but when I look at this story, I'm like, why didn't they just know? They've seen all this stuff Jesus can do. I mean, they'd seen him heal a demon-possessed man. They'd seen Jesus calm a storm. I mean, why? And then I have to stop and look at myself, and I've seen what he's done in my life. And then I still don't trust him. I'm no different. You're no different. We forget really easily. You know what? Sometimes things in our lives are going to seem impossible. Don't focus on that problem. Focus on who you're going to give it to. Because Jesus can do the impossible with it. So let's keep reading here. It says immediately after this. So after he just fed all of the people, he'd been teaching them. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples, he said to his disciples, all right. He said, let's get back in the boat. Let's try this again. All right? So we're going to get back in the boat. And they head across the lake to Bethsaida. And he sent people home. And after telling everyone goodbye, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. We know in John chapter 12, by the way, when this is another one of the Gospels speaking about what's happening here. There were some people at this point, after seeing Jesus do this miracle, they wanted to make him king. They were trying to say, okay, let's go down to Jerusalem and let's do something with these Romans. And Jesus kind of stayed behind and calmed people down and said, hey, this isn't the time for this. Okay, so that's why he stays behind. He calms people down a little bit. And then in verse 47, it says, late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. And he saw that they were in serious trouble, and they were rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves. And at about 3 a.m, Jesus came toward them walking on water. Now, here's what's really interesting, and this is a detail that I've missed before. It says right after that, it says, he intended to go past them. Why would he do that? Why would you go out there and, walk on water? And you're just going to hey guys, and just walk on by, I mean, while they're sitting here rowing and they're going through this awful storm, But then it occurred, and I read some places too. This was the common practice of God in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God would not fully reveal himself, but he would walk by to bring reassurance, to bring peace into that moment. So that's what Jesus was intending to do. But when they saw him walking on water in verse 49, they cried out in terror, thinking that he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him, but Jesus spoke to them at once, and he said, don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here. So he was going to walk right past him, but when they cried out, he then stops. And then he speaks to them in this moment of fear, in this moment of terror. It's interesting, this word ghost that we see here there's a Greek word for it. We'll bring it here on the screen. It's phantasma, which is an apparition or a ghost, how it's often described. But really there's more to it than that. It's really a manifestation of God's power. They saw something that was far beyond anything they could understand. And what does Jesus do? He tells them not to be afraid. We see here one of these famous I am statements. We see this a lot. Jesus says this a lot in the Gospels. And what does he say? He says, I am what? Here. If you actually took this literally, here's what he's actually saying. He's telling them, he's saying, be courageous. So be strong, be courageous. And then he says, I am, period. Well, we know in the Old Testament, God often refers to himself as I am who I am. So here again, we see another connection with the Old Testament of Jesus as being God himself. So literally he's saying, be courageous. I am. Don't be afraid. Well, then in verse 51, he climbs into the boat. Can you imagine the scene in these guys' faces, the look on these guys' faces? Here's Jesus just walked across the water, and then he's just kind of climbing in the boat, you know. Storm's over now, and they've got to be like, whoa, what's going on here? The wind stops, and they were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. And look what it says. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. So it seems like in the early going with this story, they didn't quite understand it. Now later on, they did. It was in all of the Gospels. But at this moment, they couldn't quite get it. But here again is another example of something. Should they have been surprised that Jesus could do this? Honestly, they shouldn't have been surprised. They should have been like, oh, there's Jesus, walking on the water again. Oh, there's Jesus providing food to everyone. Really, after everything they had seen, that's really the reaction that they should have had. And yet, here it is, as it says here, their hearts were too hard to take it all in. They were so busy looking at things in life like a person, like you and me would. So one person, when I was reading something this week, they said that they had a horizontal view, not a vertical view. That's where we are at, most of us in our life. We spend a lot of time looking horizontally at the issues, the struggles, the challenges, the impossibilities in our lives, and we forget that we serve a God. We forget that we should have this vertical view of a God who can do the impossible. Well, after they had crossed the lake in verse 53, they landed at Gennesaret, and they brought the boat to shore, and they climbed out, and again, the people recognized Jesus at once, and they ran throughout the whole area, carrying sick people on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, in villages, cities, or the countryside, they brought the sick out to the marketplaces. They begged to let him touch the sick, and at least the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. It's easy to kind of jump over this little, because it's kind of a transitional paragraph for us as we go further into the book of Mark. But there's something here that we see, and we see the compassion of Jesus. Even though he was tired. It can't be easy walking on water, right? Even though he had just provided food for thousands. He had to have been tired, and yet what did he do? He had compassion, and he healed, and he brought God's love. But you know what? When I look at this story, there's something else that we see about Jesus, and it's this. Is that Jesus' power is magnified as he steps into our struggles. If you want to see the power of Jesus in its most rarest form, its simplest form, is let him show you himself. Let him show himself in your problems. I don't know if you're like me. You probably are. Whenever I run into problems, I tend to pray more. Anybody else like that? Shouldn't be that way. I should pray all the time. But whenever I run into problems, I ratchet it up a notch or two in my prayer. Why is that? Because I think Jesus reveals himself to us even greater in our struggles. Just like he did to them on that night when they were out on the shore, eating that day when they didn't have enough food. Jesus was there, and he was more apparent to them in the middle of their struggles. I like what William Barclay said. He said, to walk with Christ will be for us also the conquest of the storm. I love that. When we walk with Jesus, we're going to walk into storms, but when we walk into storms, we're going to see Him a whole lot easier. So much more clearly. You know, the reason we can know that God does the impossible is that He has stepped into the impossible and He has made it a reality. And we see that in both of these stories. See, when we hurt, when we struggle, God is not afraid to get in the mess with us. But it's often hard to accept that, because what happens is we often refuse to trust that God will do what He says He will do. You know, there was a book that came out some years ago, our church even, I think we did a sermon series on it, called The Christian Atheist. Remember that series? I don't know if any of you remember it. It's been a while back. But the whole premise of the book was the idea that we can have faith in Christ, but not really trust Him. And in that process, are we really having faith? And the answer is no. You can't really have faith when you don't trust someone. That's what a Christian atheist is. And I feel like that's where a lot of us find ourselves. In Hebrews chapter 11, here's what it says. It is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to Him must believe that God exists and that He rewards those who sincerely seek Him. We can't please God without faith. We have to trust that God is doing what's best for us, even in the middle of the storm, even in the middle of the storm that you're walking through today. And so as we come into 2023, is this going to be the year where God is shown through you? Is this going to be the year where that faith that you so want to have, that's going to trust Him even in the worst of storms, is this the year where it's going to finally come out? I hope so. That's my prayer for you today. Is that this year would be different than years past, where you take Jesus at His word and you believe that He can truly do the impossible. Here's where I want to challenge you. Here's the point that I want to make today, and I think this is what we see in these two stories. Add what you can, but let Jesus do the multiplying. See, about this statement, we're limited. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't have all the tools we need to fix all the problems we have. We just don't have some of those tools. So what do? In a moment like that? We put ourselves into it, but we let God do the multiplying. We let God bring His tool bench, bring His toolbox to fix the issues, the problems, the challenges that we're going through. All too often, though, we find ourselves in one of two places. We either try to do everything or we do nothing at all. We either try to overcompensate or we totally shut down. Have you ever done that with a problem before? Maybe you just go crazy and you're trying to figure it out and you're trying to fix it and you do all this stuff, or maybe you just totally shut down. I've done that before too. And sometimes what we do is we leave God totally out of the picture. We have these two extremes. We either leave God out of the picture, and sometimes we even leave ourselves out of the picture. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll say, you know what, it sounds very religious and very Christian to say this, but what we'll say is, I'm just going to leave it all in God's hands. It sounds great. But God says, you know what? I want you to put yourself in my hands. There is something you need to do in this. You have to engage in this problem too. And I'm going to walk you through it, and we're going to walk through this storm together, just like the disciples, right? I mean, Jesus says, go out and find the food, bring it back. Of course, they didn't know it at first, but later they saw Jesus multiplied it. Take the problem that is confronting your life today, put it in His hands, and let Him multiply it. We should not be in the business of multiplying, because the fact is that so often when we try to multiply, we come up short. So again, as we enter this year, are there challenges in front of you that you have tuned God out or that you have not put yourself into? Don't fall into one of those extremes. Maybe if we're talking about a marriage, maybe your marriage is a wreck and it's just easier to tune out. It's just easier to just let things be the way they are, leave God out of it, and maybe even leave yourself out of it. That's not what God wants you to do. Maybe your finances are going in a really bad direction, and it's gotten to the place where you haven't really consulted with God about what the right path is to use your finances, and maybe you've just tried to leave yourself out of it, so you just leave it to somebody else. Maybe it's your spouse or whoever. Don't fall for those extremes. I know we have students in here. I want to challenge you students as you're starting a new calendar year, right? Maybe your grades are struggling at school. And the temptation is to say, well, you know what, I'm just going to have God, I'm going to just pray and God's going to help me. Or maybe it's just like, I can't do this. There's just no hope for me. Don't fall into those extremes. God wants to do something impossible through you, but He wants you to be a part of it. You have to say to God, and we see this over and over again in the Old Testament, you have to say to God, I'm all in. But you're going to have to make up the rest. And God honors that. God will take what you have, when you add what you can, and He will do the multiplying. That's what He does. Because see, when we try to multiply ourselves, we better be prepared to come up short. Maybe you're trying to fix everything on your own in your life right now. You're trying to fix your spouse. You're trying to fix your finances. You're trying to fix your grades, and you're leaving God out of it. Let me tell you, if you think you can do it on your own, you're going to come up short. You need to welcome God into that. What's gripping to me in each of these stories that we've read today is that each of them required something. There was a little bit of food, a little bit of rowing, right? It required something. But then what did God do? He took it and He multiplied it. There's a story one time, there was this house, it was in Illinois. This man by the name of Ken Erickson, his wife was cleaning out leftovers from the refrigerator. She gave the one remaining portion of a tortellini to their 6-year-old son, Jeremy. Now their 8-year-old son, Matthew, also wanted some, and so what did they do? They started arguing with one another over who was going to get it, and after several unsuccessful attempts to mediate the dispute, the dad decided that he was going to take a theological approach to this. And so here's what he does. He was hoping to convince Jeremy to share his portion with Matthew, and he said, Jeremy, what would Jesus do in this situation? And Jeremy, he knew his Bible because he said, oh, Dad, he would just make more, See, we have to leave it in God's hands. Let Him create the more. Let Him change the heart. Let Him change the mind. Let Him provide the resources. But you have to be involved in the process. You have to surrender to Him. And so my challenge for us this week is this. I want to challenge you to take an impossibility in your life and ask this question: am I giving it to Jesus or trying to multiply it myself? I really do hope, as I've been sharing with you today, that you're thinking of something that you've been challenged with. And so if you have been, take this question to that. Am I giving that, am I giving that to Jesus, or am I trying to multiply this or fix this thing all by myself? I think, in my opinion, I think this would be a really good thing to ask as we enter into this new year. As we're thinking of resolutions or changes or whatever, am I going to give this over to God, or am I going to try to continue to do this by myself? Am I going to re-engage a marriage and seek God to come into it? Am I actually going to look at my finances and allow God's principles to guide them? Am I really going to work hard in school and let God lead me in doing better with my classes? See, God has a way of multiplying things. But you know what so often happens is we have to hold on to something for ourselves. We have to do it ourselves. I don't know if you've heard this before. I think I might have shared this story once before, but I think it's such a great illustration of where all of us are, I think. I don't know if you've ever heard, but native hunters in the jungles of Africa, they have this really clever way of trapping monkeys. Here's what they do. They slice a coconut. They take a coconut and they cut it in half. And they hollow it out, and in one half of the shell, they cut this little hole that's just big enough for a monkey's hand to reach into the coconut. And then what they and then what they do is they put an orange in it that monkeys want to get. They put an orange in it, then they put the coconut back together. And then they just kind of leave the coconut wherever. They put it on a tree or a rope or wherever. And then they sit there and wait. And a monkey comes along and is like, oh, I want an orange. So what does he do? He puts his hand in there and he tries to get but he can't get the orange out because the orange is too big for it to come out through the hole. And so he's sitting there and he's fighting with this really, comparatively speaking with his body weight, really big coconut, trying to get this orange out. And the whole time he's preoccupied with trying to get this orange out, the hunters come up and they throw a net and they catch him. I'm afraid some of us have been ensnared too. We're so busy trying to hold on to that thing for ourselves. And we're not willing to hand it over and say, God, I'm going to give myself and I'm going to give this problem, all of it, all of me and all of it, to you. And so I want to challenge you to make a multiplying resolution for this year. Give yourself to God and whatever you're facing. Make a recommitment and let Him work through you. I like what William Shedd once said. He said, a ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. There is something right now in your life that you've probably avoided, either with God or yourself, because it's going to take some work. It might be hard. It might even hurt. God didn't create you to just live in that hurt. You might have to go out and stretch yourself a little bit this year, but it's going to be so worth it. You know what? It's really tiresome to multiply, but it's much easier to just add yourself. And so coming off of 2022, you might be tired. Perhaps it's because you've been trying to take the role that only Jesus can fill. Only Jesus could be a multiplier. See, remember, whenever God wants to do something spectacular, He does it through something that was seemingly impossible. He begins with an impossibility. And so today, I want to I just want to invite you. Maybe you've never given your life to Christ. Let me tell you, there's no way in the world that you can earn your way to heaven. Impossible. But I know someone who can. Jesus gave His life on the cross for you, and He is inviting you today to accept that invitation. But maybe we've been ensnared like the little monkey, and we're so focused on ourselves and the world around us and our problems and making a living and all. We've put all those things to the side, and we haven't truly sought God out. Today is an invitation for you and me to let go of the orange, to give Him the coconut, and for us to say, you know what, Jesus, I'm going to give myself to you today.